Hi, thanks for joining us on the Built for Wellness podcast. My name is Corey. I'll be your host. Here we talk to building engineers, environmental inspectors, and doctors. We discuss how the building environment can affect those with hypersensitivity and other medical conditions. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks again for joining us on the Built for Wellness podcast. This is Corey, your host. I've got a very special guest with me today. His name is Michael Rubino. He's with All American Restoration, based in the Northeast and in North Florida now, right? Mike, you guys just opened up down there, right?
Yeah, North and Central Florida. That's
awesome. So a little bit more about All American and his team. I'd say, in my opinion, easily the top remediation contractor in the country. Between our network of different inspection companies, he's our go-to referral, particularly when individuals are dealing with hypersensitive conditions, chronic illness, Lyme, autoimmune issues. He really understands not just the health side of things, but the important part of it, right? Building science and how to properly remove the sources of contamination within the environment, but also the byproducts that we talk a lot about here on Built for Wellness, that dispersion factor that happens with those ultrafine particulates. And today we're going to just kind of talk back and forth about some of his experiences. Why is he so good, and what is the rest of the industry lacking? And I'd like to just go ahead and introduce Mike and have him say a few words about him and his company. Mike, welcome.
Well, thank you for that introduction. That was very humbling.
What is it different about your process, your approach that makes you so successful? Is it the approach from the assessment companies that you're working with? Is it that your team is just that meticulous and that good? Or are you doing something different that most other companies aren't doing?
Well, I'd say probably all of the above. The first important thing you need to have is a good mold inspection company. I can't tell you how many times I've received reports and I go to someone's house and it's like, there's, let's say, water intrusion in the basement, and they'll say, just wipe down the basement. It's like, well, there's mold growing behind the walls and you have to remove the walls to get to that mold. So wiping down the basement's not going to really do anything, right? The second you would clean the basement, the mold spores would be reproducing the contamination, and boom, there'd be high levels of mold all over the basement again. So that's obviously an important factor. And then if you do have a good mold inspection company that's able to find the mold and find all the sources and give you the analytical data to show you how high the contamination load is in the house, I mean, that's really the nice first step of being able to tackle the project successfully. So once you have that, following the protocol obviously is of key importance, because you want to make sure you're removing all the sources. But once you have the post-test showing all the sources are removed, that's when things, really get technical. And you're doing what we call a 3-stage wipe down. And, you're successively wiping the same area with a different side of the rag, every single time, 3 times over. You also obviously still need the HEPA vacuum. You still need to have air scrubbers and engineering controls in place so that anything that does get aerosolized is not going to just stick to a new surface.
A lot of remediation companies really are set up to work directly with insurance companies dealing with very obvious problems, right? Maybe there was a leak from a window or a leak from a washing machine, and you can see the water damage and you can see how extensive that damage is in that one particular area. But what we're talking about here, really for a very technically driven inspection that is really designed for hypersensitivity, because not all cases are like this.
That's correct. Yeah, it's definitely not an inexpensive process. Unfortunately, the fine particulate cleaning and the removal of mycotoxins and endotoxins, it's just labor intensive. Just having 3 men on site wiping down your whole home, depending on the size of your home, it's going to get costly very quickly. As far as what you said about insurance companies, you're right. There's a big problem with insurance, mainly the coverages. First off, people aren't typically covered properly. They may not have mold coverage at all, or maybe only have 10,000. That's pretty much the standard that we see. On top of that, they use programs called Xactimate or Symbility, and these programs don't have a mycotoxin button, for instance. So if you have mycotoxins and you're trying to explain to the insurance company, I need to get rid of these mycotoxins, and the mycotoxins were created by the covered loss, they're going to look at you like you have two heads. They don't even know what mycotoxins are. And when you finally start sending them literature on it and explain to them that it's a real thing and it needs to be addressed, don't really know how to price it out. For that reason, we typically try to bill by the hour and just include that process that we do to remove those things. But even then, they're going to try to refute it. So unfortunately, there's just no standard set for these things yet. Many of the standards that you guys have initially set are really the only standards out there. And we've kind of taken those standards and perfected it to a point where we can now offer a full guarantee to our clients that, yes, we can actually reduce these levels to a level where they're no longer affecting you. And that's really the key for us. But I don't know how long it's going to take the insurance industry to catch up to this, or, just a whole, the EPA or the CDC. None of these things are on their radar, and that's really where things need to change.
Yeah, and I think that is a longer fight from a regulatory perspective up top. But
yeah,
staying on the topic of insurance, Mike, we don't get too involved with insurances on the consulting side because we're diagnosing the problem. Anytime on the front end, as a consultant, you're not really interfacing because at that point the client hasn't really proven yet what the cause of the problem is. And I think this is a topic that really we get a lot of questions about. Maybe you could kind of share your knowledge on what the best approaches are when dealing with insurance and mold, and what's typically covered or not covered.
Yeah, so if you're sensitive, I would say the first thing you're going to want to do is consider hiring a public adjuster. And a public adjuster, they're kind of like an attorney in a sense, where they're going to bat against the insurance company on your behalf. Because obviously the insurance companies have a fiduciary responsibility to make money. So they want to really minimize things as much as possible. You also got to pay attention to the way your policy's written, because what they consider a covered loss is really a sudden and accidental occurrence. And if you're sensitive and you have multiple areas, you have to really take a look at, did I have multiple sudden and accidental occurrences that led to this mold growth? They don't just cover mold. They cover the water damage that then created the mold. And if you do have mold, the next thing you want to look out for is, how much mold coverage do I have? And there will be a clause that says mold and fungi in your insurance policy that you'll want to pay attention to. The next thing you want to pay attention to is another little subcategory called aggregate. So aggregate means the total amount they'll pay in a 1-year period. So if you have, let's say, $10,000 per occurrence and a $20,000 aggregate, but you have 3 different claims, and each claim is $10,000 in mold, they'll basically pay for 2 out of the 3 claims, leaving you stuck to pay for the third one. So it's very tricky. They do that on purpose, obviously, because mold can be expensive. They know it, and they want to really minimize the money they're paying out. So what I recommend is, if you're listening to this now, call your insurance company, up your mold coverage to whatever it is now, to as high as it can go. Because if you ever do have a covered loss, odds are it's more expensive than what your standard coverages are.
Yeah. So is that when you're talking about a public adjuster, do they pretty much break down your policy, look at your reports, and then they become the liaison? Is that how that works?
Yeah, so it's similar to hiring an attorney, right? They're going to review all the documentation that you have. In this case, it would be your policy. They'll advise you of your rights. They'll basically settle the claim for you on your behalf. Obviously, you approve everything that they're doing, but the idea is the insurance company off the bat is going to try to nickel and dime you. If you're trying to handle this as a homeowner and you're not educated on either the insurance process or the different costs involved with an insurance claim, and removing the problem and fixing it and putting it back together, they're going to take advantage of that, right? They want to pay out as little as possible. I have so many cases to discuss. I'll just bring one up very quickly. We're working on a project in Florida, and they're, let's say, giving her $3 a square foot for tile. Well, she went back and found a receipt showing that she actually paid $12 a square foot for that tile. So she's having to fight the insurance company on how much they're paying. They want to see receipts. It's really not a cut and dry process. And I think having a public adjuster on your side to help you out and really make sure that you're getting as much money as you can towards repairing the home, it's really important because they're not going to cover certain things, and you really need as much money as you can to repair the home properly, because we know they're not going to cover if an ERMI score is high. We know they're not going to cover if you have mycotoxins. So we need to, you need to make sure you have enough money there so that a mold remediation company can actually address those things.
Got it. So it sounds like it's a very much a team approach, working with the public adjuster. How do they get paid? What's their fee structure look like? Just so when people listening to this are reviewing and interviewing public adjusters, they know what looks right and what looks suspicious.
Yeah, so I think the typical standard rate is somewhere between 10 and 20% of the claim. It's completely negotiable, obviously. It's a service, so you have the ability to negotiate with the public adjustment company and say, look, this is what I feel comfortable outlaying because of the expenses involved. I know I'm going to have out-of-pocket expenses no matter what. So, you kind of negotiate with the person. It also is going to depend on how much work's involved. If it's a very technical case and the public adjuster is going to have to do a lot of work, they may want to charge more. So it's about being comfortable with the adjuster, making sure they're the right adjuster too, making sure that they're knowledgeable on the subject and can really help maximize your claims so that you have less out-of-pocket expenses. That's really the key.
Yeah, that's great. And thanks for sharing that information. I think that's a really useful part of this process. And obviously not every case is needed for a public adjuster, but as you said, for some of these more technical ones, it really is a good idea, particularly if you're hypersensitive, because many times you're not just not educated on the topic, right? But you're sick and you're trying to navigate through this process. And that's when, things get missed or things are said that may hurt the opportunity for getting certain amounts of money back from insurance process. So I'd like to just kind of start talking a little bit about the flow of how all of this works, right? What do you see as the perfect flow for a client when they figure out or think that they have a mold problem? What are the steps as a remediation company or would like to see by the time they reach you?
Yeah, so the first step is, of course, getting a mold inspection and getting the right report generated to really see where the sources are, so that those can be addressed first, and figuring out what sort of contamination has been created from those sources, so you can really figure out what needs to be done to bring those levels down, right? So that when you walk into your home and you stay there, you're not constantly affected by the contamination that was left behind. And that's really step one. Step two would be probably getting the remediation company out there. Getting the insurance company involved really is going to take having someone help identify what we would call a covered loss. So, they don't just cover all water intrusion. So if you have water seepage in the basement, that's not covered. A leak from a window, unless it's from an actual storm or something, is not covered. So before wasting your time calling the insurance company, it may be good to get your remediation contractor out there to identify if there really is any covered losses. And at that point, you would want to probably negotiate with a public adjuster to help fight on those covered losses. You have to understand that if you have multiple source areas, that not everything will be covered. It's only the actual instances that the insurance company considers a covered loss would be covered. So helping to understand how much money the insurance company would be responsible for and how much money you would be responsible for would give you a good picture of how to tackle the project. And obviously, if you don't have the cash on hand to tackle the project, there's financing options, home equity line of credit, things that you can do to get the cash on hand to perform the project. So, those are really the first steps towards starting the remediation project.
It's about following a line of action items to be successful down the road. So it's really important to make sure that by the time they've reached you or a remediation company in general, they've kind of gotten a really good idea of exactly what you said, where the problems are and what the next steps need to be, so that you can put together your project bid on what it's going to cost to get rid of the problem. All expectations are understood and met from everybody, and you're kind of helping move down the field to getting to this healthy home that we all hope to be living in, to heal back to health. Now, wrapping things up here for today, what are some of the, I guess, 3 main takeaways that you would want people to remember from this talk today?
The 3 main takeaways is, the most important part is finding a good mold inspector. If you find a mold inspector who just doesn't seem to be on the ball and have your best interest in mind, maybe isn't believing that you're even sick, that's probably not the mold inspector for you. If they're not going to do some of the more progressive testing to see what's actually going on inside the home as far as the contamination is concerned, probably not the mold inspector for you. Because if you're sensitive, that picture, that data is really important to understand, because then you won't know how to fix it, right? The second thing is you want to hire a mold remediation company that specializes in doing remediation for mold sensitive individuals if you are indeed mold sensitive. That's an important part of the process, because if they're not experienced in removing the fine particulate, the toxins, odds are after the remediation, when you move back in, you're still going to not feel well. So I think that's a huge takeaway. And then third takeaway is, how to deal with the project, how to deal with the financial aspect of the project. Should you consult with your insurance company? Should you get a public adjuster? These are all questions that you'd want to ask yourself. You'd want to, check if there's a covered loss to even get the insurance company involved. Talk to your financial advisor to see, what your options are with financing the project.
Yeah. And I think the final point to all of this, right, and the importance for everybody listening is a team, right? You can kind of hear how we go back and forth on these topics, and I've worked with Mike on many projects in the past. But having a consultant, a remediation company, a medical practitioner, this is your team. These are the individuals that are going to help push you through to transforming back to health, and it's so important.
Yeah, definitely. And I would add one more component to that. You may also want to consider a building biologist as well, because obviously after remediation, you'll be left with a home that you need to put back together. And understanding how to put it back together to avoid future mold growth conditions is equally as important as removing it in the first place. So if your budget allows for it, hiring a building biologist, and believe it or not, they're actually probably one of the cheapest components of the picture, is probably a key component to it, just making sure that you're using building materials that aren't going to make you sick, and you're building the place back in a way where the structure can breathe, it's ventilated properly, it controls the humidity, and really just stops moisture problems from occurring.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it on the head, right? We're not just fighting mold. We're not just trying to prevent it in the future, remove it now and then forget about it. If you don't fix the problem, it's going to come right back. And having the right rebuild team is extremely important. Our consultant to build back, not just for prevention of mold, but VOCs, formaldehyde. We live in a world where toxins are around us at all times. So making sure we're not building back with cheap materials and is going to be an extremely important part of this to prevent any issues in the future.
Absolutely.
Thank you again, Mike, for joining me today on the Built for Wellness podcast. Again, Mike owns a restoration company called All American, based in the Northeast as well as Central Florida areas.
Our website is allamericanrestoration.com. I know it's a bit long, but easy to spell. And
Perfect.
you could go on our website. We have a lot of information on there as well. course, you could always give us a call too, and we're happy to provide free consultations over the phone to discuss anything that you may need.
Thanks again for joining us on the Built for Wellness podcast. Again, my name is Corey Levy. I've been your host for today. Please, if you like what you heard, give us a thumbs up, share our podcast with your friends and family, and make sure you check out our social media pages for new upcoming episodes. We'll see you next time on the Built for Wellness podcast.